But 2 points here. So one is, I want to say that is not the same thing as Mises' calculation argument. All right? Mises' calculation argument stipulated all of that. Mises said he conceded a bunch of stuff for the sake of argument. He said, number one, let's assume that the planners are noble, benevolent people, that they really are just trying to more efficiently organize their society's means of production in order to deploy them into the most socially beneficial channels. Okay, that in other words, they didn't seek that position because they love just holding arbitrary power over their fellow man, or they don't want to punish their enemies, or, they don't have territorial ambitions and want to seize control to, beef up the military. No, imagine that, let's just, for the sake of argument, suppose there is an absolute angel who took over the central planning job. Okay. So Mises concedes their intentions. He also concedes the motivations of everybody else in society. That, suppose that no matter what the planners suggest, there's no grumbling, there's no shirking. Everybody happily reports to whatever job, they relocate to whatever city, they live in the most abhorrent conditions if the plan calls for it, perhaps temporarily. You got to move out of your nice house now and go live in this hut for a couple of years because we need those resources to go do something else that's more important. And they say, okay, yes, sir, yes, comrade, we happily do it for the good of the socialist commonwealth. Okay, so he assumes away all the incentive problems. And he also assumed away the concentration and aggregation of technical knowledge and consumer preferences. Mises even stipulates and says, suppose the central planners know perfectly well all the different technical recipes and how do you take a given combination of inputs and transform them into various possible combinations of outputs. Suppose that there's no problem, there's no ignorance on the part of the planners that they're drawing up the blueprints without access to that technical knowledge, that they assume that they have at their disposal, all the expertise that's embedded in all the people in their community. Okay, so he concedes that. And like I said, he also concedes that they know how the public would rate various possible combinations of consumer goods. Right. So to say, would it be better if we could make 16 more cartons of size 5 diapers for babies, or should we make 18 more television sets, of these dimensions and quality? And that suppose there's no doubt that the planners either can just use their own rankings on that, being paternalist, or that somehow they have access and get a feel for what the public thinks in terms of ranking various types of, discrete bundles of consumer goods and services. And Mises says, still, even if you stipulate all that, there is this fundamental calculation problem that the planners, in order even ex post to say, did we come up with an efficient use of society's scarce resources, that we told everybody, okay, here's what you do. Use the farmland and you're going to do this. And here's the buildings, and this many workers are going to report to each building and work this many shifts and blah, blah, blah. And you're going to get this much steel, and you're going to produce this many cars, and you're going to produce this many decks for homes and these locations, and and grocery stores are going to be located in these coordinates and blah, 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 right? And you're going to do all that stuff, and everyone does it. Nobody shirks, nobody commits private crime on the side, right? All this stuff. Still, the problem is, nobody would know ex post whether that constituted an efficient use of society's scarce resources, because the people, they don't have the costs, right? They don't know the value of the inputs that were used up compared to the value of the outputs that were produced. That's the fundamental problem. So let me just mention at this point that I will put in the show notes page a post that I wrote for Mises.org a few years ago at this point, where I really carefully go through and spell out how there's a distinction between the Misesian calculation argument and the Hayekian knowledge problem, or Misesian calculation problem. let me also, just as an offshoot of that, explain that, I don't think that I'm quibbling here, that the market socialists themselves, like the economists who back in the day during what we call the socialist calculation debate argued with, against Mises and then Hayek when he joined the fray, they also perceived a difference rhetorically. All right, so here I'm cribbing from my Mises.org piece, which again we'll link to in the show notes page. But here, so H.D. Dickinson in 1933 is responding to Mises' original salvo, right? So and by the way, Mises, it was in 1920 that he had an article that came out. It was in German originally, where he lays out what we now call, the calculation problem or the calculation argument against socialism, where Mises says what I just walked through, that without having a common denominator, you can't, without being able to put all the various types of inputs, which originally are just, different types of goods and services and things, how do you amalgamate 16 hours of a brain surgeon's time and 16 hours of a street sweeper's time and 6 barrels of crude oil? Like, how do you add those all together and say, what's the value of those resources, and then compare it to the output that you might make and say, oh, well, we could use those to, and with some other things too, obviously, we could contribute and make whatever, this many diapers and this many jet aircraft engine and this many and how do you say, was it worth it? Did we produce more valuable outputs than the inputs that were used up in producing them? And again, if originally in the raw state or the original state, these things are just different units of various goods and services and resources and things like that, how can you do it? It's not, the point is, it's not an engineering problem. It's not an issue of getting the right expert in the room. All right. Now, where it is solved in practice is in the market economy, where those resources are privately owned and there's genuine market prices that are formed. And so then, ex post, an accountant can come in and show the owner, yep, here's the profitability of the various lines in your enterprise. Yep, and these lines were profitable, these ones weren't. And what do we mean by that? To say, oh, the revenue you got from your customers was insufficient to cover the expenditures for those lines. That's what it means to be unprofitable. You suffered a loss. Okay, and I'm dumbing it down a little bit, but that's the gist of the argument. So that's the problem with outright central planning, because there isn't genuine private property and markets and genuine market prices for the means of production. And then Mises pivots to show, and this is how capitalism, the market economy with private property and the use of money, that's how it solves this problem that plagues socialism, right? Okay, so Mises laid all that out originally in a 1920 article, and then he later had a whole book on socialism that came out shortly thereafter. So Dickinson in 1933 used an argument based on Walrasian general equilibrium, right? So Dickinson was a trained mathematical economist, and he was saying, look at the socialist central planners can solve things in the same way that the market economy does, right? And Dickinson's understanding of how the market economy solves these problems is, here's a system of simultaneous equations, and you've got all the consumer preferences, and you've got all the production functions, and so it's a matter of just, finding a price vector that satisfies all these equations where the firms maximize profits and the households maximize utility, blah, 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 blah. There you go. And this is how we do it when we're modeling a market economy. If you went and studied economics at the top schools, that's what they would teach. And, how does the market work? That's what you would do. How do you find the competitive equilibrium? There you go. And why couldn't central planners at least approximate that? Yeah, maybe they'd get something wrong here or there, but this Mises guy is making it sound like qualitatively there's some, fatal flaw with socialism when, no, what are you talking about? This is what they would do, right? So that's what his argument was. And so Hayek answered that in 1935. And here's what Hayek said. So he referred to these mathematical solutions to the Misesian challenge, and Hayek said, yes, what Dickinson wrote, and then the quote, this is the exact quote from Hayek, is not an impossibility in the sense that it is logically contradictory. But then he went on to say the reason, Dickinson's attempted response to Mises doesn't work, and this is Hayek now, what is practically relevant here is not the formal structure of the system, but the nature and amount of concrete information required if a numerical solution is to be attempted, and the magnitude of the task which this numerical solution must involve in any modern community. Okay? And so then, why I think it's, so I'm saying, just looking at that, for number one, you can see where Darren's coming from. And he's saying, I think Darren did a good job of summarizing what Hayek's point was. By the way, the Use of Knowledge in Society came out, I think, in 1945, right? So Hayek has these famous papers called the Knowledge Papers, and they came out after Hayek, crossed swords with the socialists. So in the standard telling of this stuff, it's like, oh, Mises and Hayek didn't even realize how much their fellow economists had diverged from what they thought were sound economics. In other words, if you read the early Mises, you can see him saying, I don't remember the exact phrasing, but kind of like, oh yeah, all the major economists now in the wake of the subjective marginal revolution, we all agree on these important matters. And that early in his career, Mises has some passages where it looks like he thinks all the actual, professional economists at this point are all basically on the same page, which might be surprising. And so I've heard some argue that it was the socialist calculation debate that made Mises and Hayek realize, oh, wow, these guys don't think like us at all. Like, they really believe in these mathematical models of general equilibrium theory and da-da-da-da. And so after having gone through that gauntlet, then Hayek later writes what are called the Knowledge Papers, including the Use of Knowledge in Society, right? So that's, I've heard people teach like the history of economic thought from an Austrian perspective with that narrative, and that rings true to me. I think that's probably right. Okay, so anyway, in 1936, Oscar Lange joins the fray, right? So 33 is Dickinson, 35 Hayek, wrote his response that I just went through, and then a year later, Oscar Lange comes out. So Lange is another socialist. And he opens his article by paying mock homage to Mises, saying, yes, previous socialist theorists thought we could just get rid of money, that was just a barbarous relic from the, corrupt capitalist society. But thanks in part to, the objections leveled by this Ludwig von Mises character, we cutting edge socialist theorists now acknowledge and recognize, oh, you do need a price system. We can't just get rid of that is important, but we don't need private property, right? In other words, Mises, Lange thought, was putting too much weight on the private property element, and Lange just thought, no, you definitely need prices, but they're really just official, exchange ratios that they can just be announced by the central planners. You don't need a decentralized private property framework with various people bidding on, iron ore and farmland and whatnot, that you can have the central planners just announce vectors of, official exchange ratios, and we'll call those prices. And then we just give orders to the factory managers, go pretend that you're in a capitalist system and try to maximize profit on the basis of these exchange ratios that we're going to announce. Okay, so that's where Lange is coming from. But he said, thank you, Mises. And he even says, I think that the socialist commonwealth of the future should have a statue of Mises to commemorate, this contribution he unwittingly made to our noble, conquest of Earth through our superior wisdom and planning and such. Okay, so after he pays this mock homage to Mises, Lange then says, hey, here's what Mises originally said. Then guys like Dickinson gave the response and said, what are you talking about? We use mainstream mathematical economics to solve these problems that Mises raised. And then look what Hayek just said. And he, quoted what I just read to you folks. And so then now here's what Lange has to say about that. Thus, Professor Hayek and Professor Robbins, there he's talking about Lionel Robbins, have given up the essential point of Professor Mises' position and retreated to a second line of defense. On principle, they admit, the problem is soluble, but it is to be doubted whether in a socialist community it can be solved by a simple method of trial and error as it is solved in the capitalist economy. Okay, so again, the important point here is rhetorically, Lange was saying, whoa. Originally, Mises was throwing down the gauntlet and saying economic calculation in a socialist framework where there's no private property in the means of production is truly impossible, like logically speaking. But now, the mathematical economists who happen to be socialists were showing, what are you talking about? This is how you could do it, at least in principle. And then Hayek says, well, no. Yeah, sure. It's not logically contradictory, but I mean, come on. In reality, look at how complicated a modern society is. Do you understand what would be involved? In contrast to your simple, models that Ross would give you with, an apples and oranges and two people trading and you draw your indifference curves and blah, 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 right? That no, a modern economy with all the goods and services they have and all the dispersed knowledge. Come on, you couldn't do that for real, not in practice. And so Lange is going, aha, see, that's a retreat. Mises didn't just say it would be unwieldy or that the market economy could solve these problems more rapidly or approximate the answers more closely. No, Mises was saying, in principle, socialism can't do it, period, whereas the market economy can. And now you, Hayek, have weakened the claim to just saying, in practice, this couldn't be done, but in principle, it could be. All right, so I don't think Lange is being slippery there. I think what he said is true. Okay? And, now maybe someone who's a fan of Hayek might say, well, right, because if you cast Mises' original claim in that really dogmatic sense, then he is wrong. All right? And I have seen people summarize Mises' argument in a way that would render it to be invalid, put it that way. Right? Like I've seen some people say, yeah, Mises was conceding that the planners they knew how to, all the various combinations of consumer goods and how to rank them. And the planners also know every possible combination of outputs that could be produced given the original resources. And so, but they wouldn't know how to do it. And if you're familiar with mainstream economics, you can say, okay, but then that means you kind of just conceded the indifference curves ranking all the possible output bundles and the production possibility frontier showing all the combinations of output that we could produce. And so don't you just draw those two things on a graph and then find the point of tangency? And, so you can do that, at least in principle, what are you talking about, right? So anyway, but my point is whether you think Hayek wisely retreated strategically to a more defensible fortress or whether you think he foolishly, agreed to too much and threw out the bulk of Mises' argument and tried to defend a weaker claim. Either way, I think it's crystal clear that Hayek did retreat from what Mises' original claim was. And so it's, again, I don't think it's just unnecessarily quibbling or something or just trying to cause controversy for some of us, particularly in the Rothbardian tradition, to say the Misesian calculation problem is distinct from the Hayekian knowledge problem. Okay. So the way, I like the way Joe Salerno handles this. I had all these things going around in my mind, and then when I read this article by Joe, it helped crystallize for me and say, yes, that's what it is. And it helped me move on with my life.